Hi, everyone. I'm Kurt Roney, uh, one of the instructors in this course on international business. In this recording, I'm going to run through a few slides to acquaint you with some trends in international economic events. It's a fairly broad scope of information that we'll be covering, simply to acquaint you with the wide variety of international economic trends that you should be aware of as you work your way through this course, and for that matter, after the course is over, because these are the trends that tend to indicate how balances of trade occur and the forces, economic forces that occur throughout the world that influence those balances. So we'll be talking about a broad variety of international economic and financial dynamics that you should be aware of both during this course and for the rest of your business career, because international trade and international economic dynamics increasingly influence not just the economic and business conditions of various countries around the world, but this one as well. More and more, the United States is becoming part of a global economic community, and its gross domestic product as a proportion of the world's gross domestic product is large, but it's declining over time. And that's because the importance of other countries' economic activities is growing as those economies increase. And some cases are increasing much faster than the United States. So with that, what I'd like to do is just to bring up some PowerPoint slides now and just run through them. These same PowerPoint slides will be available all by themselves on your Moodle shell, so that you can run through them again at your convenience. Might need to do that before the test that you'll have on this first section of the course material later on. So with that, let me see if I can bring these PowerPoint slides up. There we go. And let me see, sorry. I need to try to get those guys up here. And that should do it. Let me see. There we are. Okay. So let's just get going. I'm going to try to get going. There we are. So here we have some trends in population. And what you can see right away is then in the upper right-hand corner, there's a significant change going on in one country, and that's India. You can see that India's population way back in 2000 was substantially larger than the population of the US today. It was already over 1 billion people. At that same time, China's population exceeded 1.25 billion people. China's population is not growing very rapidly and eventually will begin to turn down again as a result of the one-child policy that I'm sure you've heard about. But by law, folks and families in China could have no more than one child. This was hard to enforce, of course, but it was enforced pretty effectively in major metropolitan areas in the cities. And in urban areas, of course, population is concentrating as people move from rural areas into the cities. And so China's population control measures have been effective. The one-child policy, incidentally, was discontinued about 3 years ago because it now has been recognized that China's population will decline. Probably it'll start to decline by around 2020, 25. We should see it level off and then begin to decline. That's just because there will be fewer people added to the population by births. That's, of course, being offset by people living longer. The result being that China's population is aging, and that has some very real economic consequences. You can see that India's population is rising faster. Its birth rate, they don't have a one-child policy, and although its birth rate several years ago was much higher than it is today, explaining why India's population rose rapidly. But even today, the population birth rate is the so-called oh my, I can't think of the word. But the population birth rate is about 2.3 children per family. And so that exceeds the mortality rate, of course, and consequently the population rises. Aging in India isn't as much of a population simply because living conditions and health conditions and the health maintenance industry simply isn't as advanced as it is in China. So India's population is different from China's in another way, and that is that it's a much younger population, which presents its own kind of problems, not least of which is unemployment. Lots of young people. Incidentally, large numbers are entering and going through university. Consequently, there is a large number of Indian college graduates that are competing with college graduates from the United States and other more advanced economies. You've seen this yourself when you go to healthcare clinics, haven't you? See lots of folks with medical degrees from India, as well as other technology degrees. Incidentally, the education situation isn't quite as rosy as I've just portrayed it. The basic education of younger folks in India continues to be substandard, and so there are large portions of people in India that aren't very well educated at all. But those who make it, those who can get into college, very often are able to go on, and therefore we see these rising numbers of people with college education and training in technology. A whole lot of information technology is now done by American firms in India, simply because there are so many trained people available to do that work at a relatively low rate of pay. In any event, that's the primary item on this slide. You can see that the US has a population of about 330 million people, give or take a few. And it certainly is the wealthiest nation in terms of living standards. But we'll see in a minute that it's not the biggest economy in the world anymore. Down below, we see, on this slide, we see a couple other countries that are very important to the United States. Brazil, whose population is now in the neighborhood of 200 million people. And Mexico, our neighbor to the south, where we see steadily growing population as well. So let's take a look at some economic trends. And this slide is particularly interesting. You can see the world's countries and economies ranked in sequence by size on two different bases. On the left, we see the purchasing power of currency equated, and we use something called purchasing power parity to make the power of currencies in different countries more comparable. So when I've been in China, for instance, and I was interested to see that the US dollar, when I bought Chinese yuan, at that time I could buy about 6.5 yuan for $1. But if I wanted to buy a cup of coffee or gasoline or what have you, and let's just say that here in the US, gasoline costs $3. Should I have paid about 20 yuan for a gallon of gasoline in China? And the answer was no. Gasoline's a little more expensive in China, and so forth. Another good example would be in Japan. Easier example, perhaps. When I was in Japan, the U.S. dollar would purchase more than Japanese yen than 100. As a matter of fact, when I was in Japan, the dollar would purchase a lot more yen than it will today. The exchange rate back then was about 140 yen to the dollar. Today it's closer to 110. But again, let's say that before I left the US for Japan, I could buy a cup of coffee for $1. If then when I got to Japan, if I could buy 140 yen for $1, you would expect that when I went down to the coffee shop at my hotel in the morning, it would cost 140 yen to buy a cup of coffee. But it didn't cost that much. It cost about twice that much, about 250 yen to buy a cup of coffee. Why is that? Well, because coffee is more expensive in Japan. It's scarcer. There isn't as much coffee, and it takes more transportation to get the coffee into Japan than it does in the U.S. So in any event, the $1 worth of yen wasn't worth as much in terms of coffee. $1 worth of yen wouldn't buy nearly as much gasoline either, because Japan does not produce any of its own oil or natural gas. It has to import it all. and so it's much more costly. And so what we have to do is equate all those things, the purchasing power of currency. And when we equalize them out, when we make them pretty much equivalent, we can see that in the left-hand column, back in 2018, China's economy was substantially larger in terms of the value of goods and services that were available than the US economy. And today that difference has widened. So as the US grows at perhaps 2.5% per year, China grows at perhaps 6.5% per year. So the gap is widening. And that's extremely important for you to know, because what it says to you is that when you are well into your management career, dealing with the goods and services and the influence in terms of currency and other economic variables, dealing with China as a nation economically equivalent to, or even more important than the United States, is something that you're just going to have to get used to. It's very difficult for Americans to come to grips with this fact because we've become used to the idea that America's economy and military force is the largest in the world. We're the most powerful nation on earth. Not necessarily as we move into the future. China's economy is, in fact, larger than the United States. And I might add, its military power is growing quite rapidly as well. Now, if we move to the center column, we'll see what happens if we simply take bank exchange rates and apply them to currency. So using bank exchange rates, the rank changes. The US had a larger value of its goods and services, about $18 trillion, compared to only $11 trillion for China. The problem is that that's just not the way it is in real life. China intentionally lowers the exchange rate of its currency so that its industries can export more goods and services to the United States and other countries. It does that so in order to keep its economy growing at that rapid rate that we saw. And that's a source of real contention between China's government, the United States government, and other countries' governments. And we'll see more of that as we work our way through this lecture. Notice that something else has happened, and that is that when we used purchasing power parity, India came in third, not nearly the size of the United States, but nevertheless third. Now, when we look at the bank exchange rates, we see that India is number 7, and with an economy valued in US dollars, even less than France and the United Kingdom and Germany, Japan. But when we convert those when we convert Indian rupees into purchasing power in terms of goods and services, what those rupees can purchase, now we see that India's economy already is number 3. And remember that India's population is growing much faster than the United States and even faster than China. So as we move into the future, India's economy is going to have to be dealt with and taken much more seriously than it is by American business people today. If we take a look at the population we get another little reminder. We see that China's population back in 2018 was almost 1.4 billion people, and that India's was right behind it at 1.3. That's a billion people more than in the United States, which was ranked third. But we know that very soon India's population will be larger than China's. So strictly if we look at things from a long-term point of view, India's consumer economy is going to, at some day, be larger than the United States consumer economy and China's, because it'll have more people. That's a long time in the future, because India has a lot of economic catching up to do. But take a look at the rankings on this slide. When you have a chance to just sit quietly and look at this slide, take a look at where countries are on this slide, how they're ranked, and what you think that means to their economic, to those countries' economic futures, and particularly what this slide means to the United States economic future, and how important doing business internationally is going to be. So here are some graphic exhibits that point out these trends. You can see the red line in the upper left-hand chart shows China's economy breaking through the US economy, and then all of Europe, the European Union's economy, in 2013 and 2014, respectively. Over on the right, we see India's GDP growth and purchasing power parity. And you can see that it also has this uptrend. It's accelerating. The growth rate is accelerating. Referring back to Brazil and Mexico, we see Mexico on the bottom again, but growing. What's particularly interesting is Brazil. Brazil has gone through several economic and political readjustments lately. In the last 4 years, it's had 3 presidents, and it's about to have a 4th one when another election is held. I don't recall whether it's this fall or next spring, but very soon Brazil will have another election. The current president's popularity is quite low. His approval rating is even lower than Donald Trump's. That's my attempt at humor. His popularity and approval rating is below 10%, somewhere around 5%. So low that he's not even standing for re-election. And the 3 presidents ago, the president of Brazil was convicted of economic misconduct and insider trading with the Brazilian Petroleum Corporation, and as a result, he was convicted and put in jail. His successor, a lady, was from the same political party, and eventually she lost her job, and the result is the current president, and again, lacking political approval. And consequently, you can see what's happened to Brazil's GDP in recent years. It's dropped down. We see a forecast out to 2022 that was done some time ago by the United Nations, an agency of the United Nations. and it projected that Brazil's economy would pick back up. But if Brazil's political situation doesn't get straightened out, Brazil is obviously not a very attractive market for industrial corporations in the United States to invest in, or other countries for that matter. And so you can pretty much just draw the basic conclusion that if the political conditions in Brazil aren't stabilized, and if investors, corporate investors and industrial investors can't be confident in that economy, they won't invest in it. And if they don't, then Brazil's economy isn't going to meet the United Nations expectations. And I think that when I prepare these charts again, we'll find out that that in fact is the truth. Let's see, did I just skip a slide? Yeah, let's come down in. So here is the other side of the picture. This is the GDP in purchasing power parity divided by the population. So it's GDP per capita. And now we can see that the US is the wealthiest country in the world with the highest standard of living. That's not quite true. There are some small countries now that actually have higher GDP per capita than the US, but among the larger ones, the US is the leader. On the other hand, we can see that China has now slipped down to a lower level. With so many people, GDP per capita just has to be a lot lower than it is in the US. We can see that India's is also low. It's lower than China's. So in the lower left-hand corner, India's GDP per capita is only about $2,000. But you can see that by 2020, it will have multiplied 5 times. It will have grown 400% to be 500% of the level in 2000 at about $10,000. So we see this rapid growth occurring in India. And again, this gives us some idea. Now, if you look again at the chart on the left, $10,000 isn't very high if you're looking at the United States or the European Union, very low. But because of that accelerating curve that India shows us, India's GDP per capita, that is the spending power, the standards of living and the consumer spending potential in India will grow very rapidly. So we need to plan for that and be aware that the consumption potential in India is growing quite rapidly, as it is in China. Although recent events, the conflict between the US and China in trading terms has sort of put everything on hold for a while, but most of us believe this is a temporary condition rather than a long-term one. And again, you can see Brazil and Mexico. We put Brazil and Mexico on these charts because, again, Mexico is right across the border and a fairly large economy. Also, Brazil, simply because for a long time, it's been the most advanced intellectually and economically of the South American countries. Today, we might look at some other countries, including Argentina, Chile, Peru, but here we see Mexico and the largest South American economy that we tend to look at very often. Here then are some unemployment trends, and you can see that there's one standout unemployment trend on this chart, and that's the European Union, the green line at the top. And you can see that after the recession of 2008 and 9, the European Union has not responded as rapidly, has not recovered as rapidly as other nations. And it took the European Union longer to begin a recovery. And the European Union today is still struggling. Several countries in the European Union really have some difficulties. The standout problem is probably Italy. It's the third largest European economy, and yet it's really having its difficulties. Has very difficult industrial situation, largely due to politics and to the regulations that govern business practices, including everything from vacation to termination of employment. But Spain has its difficulties. Greece, I'm sure you've heard about. Indeed, the countries along the Mediterranean, Southern Europe, tends to demonstrate these kinds of problems more than the countries in the north, although they certainly aren't immune. But Southern Europe has a little bit more trouble than countries in Northern Europe. I've spent time in all those countries, but also in Central and Eastern Europe, where we see some economic difficulties as well, but lots of potential for economic growth. And when we get further north into Poland, for instance, the potential is even greater. So the balance of economic power around the world is changing, it's shifting. And again, that's something that you need to be very sensitive to, because when you receive your degree, when you move into your career, I can assure you that the conditions that exist today no longer will exist. They'll have changed. But some of these trends that I'm talking about in this video will have continued on. We'll see more purchasing power in Asia, generally speaking. And that includes China, India, Southeast Asia, and we'll see more difficulty in Southern Europe. Northern Europe, things seem to be going better. Some real questions exist regarding the remainder of the Soviet Union, and particularly Russia, where things are not quite as good. But over time, these balances and these trends will continue to shift. And to do business effectively, large corporations in particular are going to have to deal with these changing business conditions. Notice Russia, by the way, and this economic unemployment chart, rather, you can see that Russia adjusted pretty quickly, a little faster than the United States, but eventually sort of leveled off at about 5.5% unemployment. I was in Russia last year and saw quite a lot of economic lethargy, I think I would call it. And that's because, again, there are conflicts between the United States and Russia. There have been numerous sanctions, economic sanctions placed on Russia in response to its aggressive policies in the Ukraine, among other locations, in Northern Africa, and so forth. So for that reason, Russia's economy is not firing on all 8 cylinders. An interesting comment, though, was when I was in Russia last year and talked about the sanctions and the impacts that European and American sanctions have had on the Russian economy. And a lady who I think is pretty well informed looked at me and with a perfectly straight face said, "Best thing that's ever happened to us." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" Russia's economy is being penalized because Russia can't do as much business with Western Europe and the United States. And she said, you're right. We can't buy a lot of the goods that we used to purchase from Western Europe and the United States. And so we've had to take several of the industrial facilities that were mothballed and where operations were discontinued because those businesses were less efficient. They couldn't produce the quality or at the price of goods and services, goods in particular, from Western Europe and the US. So they've had to open those plants up again, which has done wonders for employment. And now the Russians have to come to grips with the fact that if they're going to improve the quality of their manufacturing and raise their economy, they're going to have to do it by improving in their industries internally. And that started me to thinking, in the long run, it may be that we've created a monster. But at the present time, I was very unimpressed by Russia's industry. However, Russia remains a nuclear power and a real military threat, but economically, simply not the powerhouse that it is in military terms. Another interesting line on this chart is China. Note that it is low. It did not respond very much to the global recession. There was a little blip. Why do you think that is? The answer, of course, is that China's is a managed economy. And I'm oversimplifying here, but essentially, and again, I've spent a lot of time in China, and I was very impressed that in China, in small towns, there's a group, a small group, a department, if you will, that's responsible for assigning people to jobs. But everybody works, or almost everybody works. And they work, the work they do, and if they're educated, is what they're qualified for. And the economy is managed, and it's growing quite rapidly. And so not only is everybody told to work, but everybody has an opportunity to work. And all of this is managed. So even during times when economies are not as robust in other countries, you can see that unemployment in China remains quite low. And then we see on the right side of this slide the Latin American countries. You can see how Argentina, which is another of the major economies in South America, has had very high unemployment, once again for political reasons. And in recent years, has begun to get unemployment under control. However, it also has some political difficulties and some significant economic problems. So on this chart back in, let's see, I can probably move this line. Let me see if I can. I sure can. So here we are about last year. Last year, while Brazil's unemployment was still up way over 10%, maybe 12%, we can see that Argentina's unemployment rate was expected to be something more like 7 or 8%. And of course, that's about twice the unemployment rate in the United States. Mexico's unemployment rate has sort of held steady at about 4.5%. So here again, we can see the difficulty in Brazil. Brazil's unemployment rate, because of the very difficult political situation in Brazil and the difficult economic policies of the folks that were in control of Brazil until Mr. Temer, the current president, was elected. His predecessors were prone to to practice economic policies that were not very productive, and the result was high unemployment. Okay, here we see inflation, and the standout here is India, where in recent years inflation has been up in the 10% category. If this forecast that was done, I think over a year ago, holds up, India's inflation has come down to about 4 or 5%. And I would tend to think that it's closer to the 5% because the economy is growing, and it has been difficult for India's government to get control of the economy, as Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister, had promised when he was first elected. Now, he was just re-elected, and so quite remarkable, even though the inflation rate, which has an influence on interest rates and more than just the price of goods and services, even though inflation has been so high, Mr. Modi was re-elected very easily. And so the current government of India is a lot more confident of its self and its position, perhaps even than the government of the United States, which seems to be in a state of flux. We can see that after inflation peaked up in China and was a little erratic again if we go back into prior years. Here in recent years, it looks like inflation has come down and has been more orderly, less rampant. Now, this picture does not really convey things the way they are at the micro level. If you go into a country such as Greece or Italy, you will find inflation to be higher. Let's see if I can make this slide go up. Okay, here we are taking a look at some interest rate trends. And we can see that these trends go through 2017. So my graphs here really need to be updated. But we can see some significant trends just the same. In the United States, we not long ago were in a period where interest rates were a lot higher than they are today. Um, and yet today our interest rates have come up a bit, I'm trying to read the chart. These are long-term interest rates, 10-year interest rates, about 3%. Today, probably about the same. If we go on to the UK, we see a fairly similar pattern, don't we? And that's because these economies are pretty much in lockstep. Germany's interest rates were even lower. Germany manages its economy much more closely than other European countries, and manages for lower interest rates. We can see that Russia's interest rates have been extremely high, and even when this chart was pulled by the Federal Reserve, these charts, FRED refers to the Federal Reserve Economic Database. You can Google FRED, all capitals, FRED, and get any one of these interest rate charts, and a whole host of US and international economic charts, mainly US charts. But to take a look at the US economy, its trends, interest rates, and so forth, it's very easy to do, and I recommend that you go. All you have to do is go to your Google page and type FRED and hit enter, and there you will see the most recent trend charts. Very easy to use. It's a real valuable source. I use it all the time. I encourage you to do the same. But you can see that Russia has a little problem with its interest rates, and normally that suggests that inflation rates are high as well. High inflation rates tend to engender high interest rates. Here we can see what was going on in Brazil. As I mentioned to you earlier, Brazil has had its problems. This chart goes all the way to 2018, last year, when long-term interest rates were down to 7%. I honestly don't recall what the interest rate is today, but what you can see is that as Brazil has suffered some of these difficult problems internally, the effect has been quite evident in financial conditions, this being only one. Another rather interesting chart is India's long-term interest rates. And we can see that they started down last year. And I think that as Prime Minister Modi gets things under control, especially now that he's been reelected with such a majority, that we'll probably see interest rates coming down further in India. Here's a chart that does not get looked at very often, and yet it should be. This is the GDP saving rate. It's not the saving rate that you often hear about. The saving rate that you often hear about is simply in the United States and in Europe, is simply private savings of consumers as a portion of the gross domestic product. But this is a different one. This measure includes consumer saving, but it also includes industrial saving, corporate profits. That's what corporate profits are, right? They're savings. If you have income and you then spend money for your home, and your groceries and your living necessities. If you have anything left over, then that's savings. And we can compute the saving rate. In the United States, that rate is pretty low, somewhere around 2%. But corporations save money too, and their savings are called profits. And those profits go onto the balance sheet as retained earnings or retained profit. And if you add those two together, the saving of consumers or individuals and the savings of corporations called profits, you get GDP savings. And that, what becomes of those savings? Well, they become available for investment, don't they? They're in a bank somewhere. They're in banks, several banks. And those savings are capital that is available to be invested in the country's infrastructure, probably. And so we see the GDP savings rates on this chart of the US, China, India, Europe, the European Union, and Russia. And where do we see the saving rate the highest? It's in China, isn't it? So is it that much of a surprise that China's economy has grown faster than more mature economies, where we would expect the corporate profits and individual saving rates to be a lot lower, especially corporate profits? But here we see that China's saving rate, its GDP saving rate, has come down in recent years as that country matures. We would expect that. Still substantially higher. And which country is second highest? And again, much higher than the US as a proportion. Remember, these are percentages, proportions, not the total amount of capital. But it's India, isn't it? Again, we remember those charts that we saw earlier. India's economy is growing rapidly, and it's accumulating the capital to do that with. Russia, a little higher than Europe and the US. Way down at the bottom is that blue line, the US. Now, since Mr. Trump's administration has inherited the government and some of the government's economic policies, we see the U.S. economy growing. And I think that when this chart is redone, we may see some changes here and a little blip upward in the U.S. line and a little blip downward in China's because of the sanctions that have been placed on China by Europe and the United States. Okay, so here are some saving rates in Latin America. The red line at the bottom is Venezuela. You've seen the news. You know what's been going on in Venezuela politically. It's very troublesome. So no surprise, the saving rate in Venezuela, highly socialist nation, very unattractive for industrial investment. So no surprise that the GDP saving rate in Venezuela has come from being very high when Venezuela was producing surpluses of petroleum and petroleum and other corporations were investing in Venezuela. Given the current situation in Venezuela, you can see that that investment has come crashing down, and corporate profits, personal saving has come down, and the impact has been disastrous. Once again, Argentina, the blue line at the bottom, for reasons that we have seen. A little uptick in Brazil. That may be good news. Mexico also is encouraging in terms of GDP saving. So here are a few trends in interest rates, or some other trends, I should say, because we saw interest rates earlier. But here are a couple charts that show what's been going on in Russia. And I probably should have put these charts earlier. You can see that in Russia's interest rates got very high for a while in 2015. But during 2017 and 18, interest rates have come down, making it easier for capital to be formed in Russia. And the rather interesting is the amount of rubles that can be purchased for $1. Let me make sure that I've got this right. Yeah. So fewer dollars then are required to buy a Russian ruble. So as I say, when I was in Russia, I think the exchange rate was about 6.5, and as it comes down, then it takes more dollars to buy a ruble. When the exchange rate went up, it took fewer dollars to buy a ruble, and it seems in just the past year or so that trend has reversed. So here's another trend that I hope you're aware of already, but this is the sales of passenger cars. And you can see that the red line, and I might add something right away, and this is just cars. It does not include trucks, light trucks like the Ford 150, and the trucks that you and I might buy instead of buying a car in this country. That's a very large portion of the market in the United States. Not so in Europe. And as you can see, if you're looking just at cars without trucks, then what a difference there is between China and other countries. Even the United States, China's car production and sales is substantially larger than the US. And that's true even if we add light trucks and utility vehicles. China is the world's largest producer and buyer. Its consumer market for cars is larger than that in the United States. When I can remember being on a boat on the Yangtze River, going north from Wuhan, an industrial city in China. And coming down the Yangtze River were these barges just loaded with cars. And of course, they were headed for Shanghai and probably also Beijing, but the river gets pretty close to Shanghai. Anyway, what was also surprising to me was that these were not the brands of cars that you're used to seeing or hearing about. And in fact, there are about 10 auto manufacturing companies in China that are strictly Chinese companies. And they export some cars, and they would like to export more. These are primarily Chinese auto manufacturers, which also produce cars with U.S. nameplates. They produce these cars for General Motors or Ford or Volkswagen. There are some very large auto producers in China, but there also are, again, about 10 that aren't so large, and they just produce cars with brands that you've probably never heard of. And yet here they were on these barges heading down river to ports where they would be consumed in China. China is a huge market for cars and will continue to be a huge market for cars as the economy grows and people have greater spending power. So now we'll take a look at some indicators of international trade. First thing I guess we should look at is simply who the United States trades with. You can see that our biggest trading partner, certainly in terms of exports, is Canada. But we import just a little bit more than we export to China. Canada. In terms of China, about the same as Canada in 2017. Oh my, what a difference, where we imported some $230 billion and exported only 49. So there was a tremendous imbalance there. And we'll see some more indicators of that in a later slide. But this, of course, is the issue that President Trump has tried to bring to our attention, that the balance of trade has not been favorable to American industry. The problem, of course, is that if you put tariffs on foreign steel, for instance, that means that America's car manufacturers are going to have to pay more for domestic steel, because if auto manufacturers can't buy it less expensively from producers outside the United States, then they have to buy steel more expensively at higher prices from domestic producers. Good for the domestic steel industries, not so good for you and me when we have to go to the showroom and pay the price that offsets that higher cost of steel. So there are gives and gets to trade balances. In any event, you can see that Mexico also has a substantial amount of trade with the U.S. Canada and Mexico, our neighbors, make a great deal of business with the United States in terms of importing and exporting. Here's a chart that I like to use. And in fact, this is my own chart. But you can see that it relates imports and exports. And the diagonal line is meant to show the balance. And you can see that many of the countries in the lower left-hand corner export more than they import. But there are exceptions. For instance, the United Kingdom imports more than it exports. So it's a net importer, just like the United States is. So there they are. When we look out to the upper right-hand corner, we can see some pretty significant facts. First of all, we see China. China clearly exports a great deal more than it imports. And once again, that's a source of contention that underlies the current trade negotiations between the US and China and other countries as well. You can see that Germany has been very successful in being a net exporter. And you know that just by looking at all the German cars that we see on American highways. But Germany has been a very effective manager of its international trade. And then we see the United States, which is far and away a net importer. This is something that the current administration is trying to deal with. Okay, here are some trends in exports of merchandise and services. And the thing to notice is where the black arrows are. You know, we had a recession, a bad one, in 2008 and 9. And you can see that when that happened, that didn't affect just the United States, it affected our trading partners. And the US was able to export far less in 2009 than it did in 2008. And so there we see the effect of the recession. We can see that services were affected also, but not nearly as much. By the way, be sure to pay attention to the size of the numbers. Here, when we're dealing with merchandise, we're talking in the trillions of dollars here. So the drop was from about 1.7 trillion to perhaps 1.3, $400 billion. Here you can see that I'm sorry, this is in trillions. So yeah, that would have been in billions. Here you can see that the service, the decline in services was from about 3.5, from about 4 trillion to 3.5, and not just about the same amount when you look at the actual dollars. So here we have merchandise exports from, and I'm having some real difficulty here. Yeah, okay. So our services exports dropped at about the same amount when we convert to dollars as merchandise. When we look at foreign direct investment, that is the placement of investment dollars in other countries, what we see is that whenever there's an economic downturn, we had a big economic downturn in 2001 and 2002, and it took a while for that recession to have its effect. But look at what the impact on foreign direct investment around the world was. And bear in mind, this isn't just the United States, this is the whole world. And you can see what a tremendous impact the recession had on investment from between countries. And that this chart ends in 2010, so it needs to be updated. But you can see that the same thing happened when we had our recession of 2008 and 9. And although the data aren't on this chart, I can tell you that once again, it took quite a while to dig our way out of that hole. And when I say our way, I mean the world. These charts reflect worldwide exports of merchandise, services, and then capital, the placement of capital between nations. So here are countries that do the most importing. And here, by the way, this red line is China. It's the largest. Fell behind the US for a little while. But you see, if you read the legend, this says total imports. And what we have in the yellow line is mainland China. And then the gray line is Hong Kong, which is now also part of the People's Republic of China, but it lives under a different set of rules and regulations and laws according to the treaties and agreements that were put in place when Hong Kong reverted back to Chinese ownership. Quite remarkable for a relatively small country. It still does a great deal of importing. So here is the mainland China, and here's Hong Kong. Here in the middle, remember my comments about Germany earlier? Look, we have the United States up here. Whoops, sorry, here in the green line. But the after China, the next biggest importer, Germany. Here are exports. No question about the export, the leading exporter. It's China by a wide margin. And down here are exports from Hong Kong. We need to total those very often. For instance, merchandise will be transferred from mainland to Hong Kong and then from Hong Kong to other countries. And that's not double accounting. It's only the Hong Kong exports that are counted in that case. So here we have mainland China. Here we have the United States, and here again, Germany. So Germany is a major player. A little bit about trade surplus and deficit, very important. You can see that these trends go out to 2018, I'm sorry, 2017. And what you can see is that the US imports are much greater than exports. In 2017, by about 36%. We have some other countries here as well. You can see that China, on the other hand, had a surplus. That is, it exported more than imported by 23%. So US had a deficit of 36%. It imported that much more than exports, whereas China exported more than it imported by about a quarter. Pardon me, I've got a bit of a rough throat here. Another rather interesting item on this slide is India. You can see that India, like the United States, has a very sizable trade deficit, and its numbers aren't nearly as large as the United States. US imports almost 2.5 trillion, exports about 1.5 trillion, for a difference of almost a trillion, 900 billion. Here we're only talking in India about 400 and 300. Nevertheless, India has a problem. This poses real problems for India's currency, its banking, its balance of payments. So worldwide, you can see that when we account for all the imports and exports, they just about balance. The differences are essentially statistical, but essentially worldwide imports equal exports. On the other hand, some countries like the United States, China, and India have surpluses or deficits. Here are a couple other interesting ones. Smaller countries in terms of their economic sizes, but Germany again has a 24% surplus, exports over imports. Russia, quite interestingly, also does. You can see how small, by the way, only about $360 billion of exports, 228 billion of imports in 2017. Notice one thing though, and that is as the exports declined, and that was due in Russia's case to the price of oil. Russia is very dependent upon exporting of oil. It's a major oil producer. And so as the price of oil fell, and as some trade restrictions were placed on Russia due to these sanctions that I mentioned, but primarily the price of oil, as those exports went down, China could not afford to, Russia could not afford to import as much. And so you can see that exports fell from 500 plus billion, 500, 340. And so the imports fell from 315 million to less than 300 to less than 200. Because Russia has a managed economy, it is able to control its trade balances more closely than the US can, even though its numbers are a lot smaller. And that's really worth bearing in mind. The Russian economy is not nearly as large as China's economy or the US economy. It's powerful because of its military might, but economically, Russia is not nearly as important as perhaps India. And very often, because of Russia's military might, we lose sight of the fact that economically, it's not as powerful as you might expect it to be. Here are just a summary in a couple of charts of US exports and imports. And you can see that US trade balances through 2017 in this case ran a deficit in the last year of over $500 billion, $553 billion. So the trade balance has been negative for many years for this entire chart, which begins before 2000. So for 20 years, the US has imported more than it has exported. That's caused us some difficulty economically. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, if we import goods and services that cost less than they would cost if we supplied them domestically, then you and I benefit because our cost of living is lower. We don't have to pay as much at the store. Here is that same trade balance just for goods, just for merchandise. And as you can see, the merchandise trade balance has become really severe. It's the goods, it's the tangible stuff. by 2017, over $800 billion. But we said a minute ago that it was over 500. What accounts for the difference? If the trade balance in merchandise is that large and getting worse, see the trend? Here's services. Our services are being exported in greater quantity than we import them. We provide financial services. I used to manage a consulting firm, and our consulting firm did work for clients outside the United States. That was an export of our services, and we collected fees from our clients outside the United States. And of course, this goes on in many industries. Many industries, in addition to providing merchandise, provide engineering, for instance, in petroleum and chemicals. What our petroleum producers do isn't just to drill for oil in other countries, but they provide the engineering and the operating services to petroleum companies in other countries, and they collect fees for that. And so you can see that we've run an increasing trade balance in services, flattened out in 2017. I imagine that because of this, of the weak economic trends in Europe and the disputes that we've had with Russia and China, that the sanctions that have been placed on those countries have probably kept the services exports at a fairly constant level that probably haven't started back up again last year. So I think probably if you just imagine that line on the lower right-hand chart flattening, you'd probably have a pretty good estimate. But I need to update these charts. Here is a summary of exports and imports and trade balances with the U.S. trading partners. Notice that that our worldwide balance in 2017 was this big $800 billion. And I'm not sure if I said that correctly a minute ago or not. This is just merchandise. It does not include services. And so if we look here, I showed you that the trade balance, the deficit was increasing and that we were up to about $800 billion. This exhibit, prepared by, I believe, the United Nations, has it at just under $800 billion. Then we can see that China's deficit, the European Union about 150, China about 375, and so forth. But the big deficit is clearly China. Okay, an interesting footnote is that these service fees that are collected by banks, financial services firms, industrial services firms, management consulting firms, CPA firms, accounting firms, and so forth, engineering firms, and the tech firms, Apple, Microsoft, IBM, Cisco, Google. These firms certainly have hard assets in other countries, but primarily they collect service revenues. Now the question is, what do they do with those revenues? And the answer, as you can see, back in 2016, was to leave those revenues in those countries. Why? Well, there were two reasons. One, if they didn't bring those revenues back to the United States, they didn't have to pay tax on them. The second reason was that sometimes, if you recall those currency exchange charts, it might be that the foreign currency was trending in a direction so that it could be expected that 1 yuan or 1 unit of foreign currency would buy more dollars if you wait for the trend to continue. And so it made perfect sense to hold on to the foreign currency until you could repatriate it, bring it back to the United States, convert that currency into dollars at a higher rate than you could if you did it immediately after you collected those fees in foreign currency. Now, the US government has solved the problem of taxation because it lowered tax rates a couple of years ago now, so that it was less costly for companies, US companies, to bring foreign profits into the United States. The tax rate was reduced. And so not all, but a significant portion of these revenues that had been kept overseas eventually came back into the United States. Still, it's the trend of currency exchange rates that can encourage sometimes foreign revenues to be kept offshore by US firms. On the other hand, when those exchange rate trends reverse and the US can buy, the US can buy more of the foreign currency. That means that the foreign currency or foreign companies with their currency can buy fewer dollars, then immediately US firms want to bring that foreign currency into the United States and convert it before its value declines any further. So just to wrap up this, this review, here are some trends in foreign exchange rates that illustrate what I was just talking about. You can see that during the time that this chart went on, through 2017, that the US dollar would buy more yuan, and consequently, the reason that was the case is that China managed the exchange rate, and they did that to encourage exports. There were international negotiations, and the result was that trend reversed at the beginning of 2017, and then the U.S. could buy fewer yuan, which means that the yuan could buy more dollars. So right now, if a company is collecting yuan as a service fee in China, it might want to hold on to them because the US will buy fewer yuan, meaning the yuan will buy more dollars as this goes on. But while this trend was going on, it was a good idea as soon as a US company made a profit, collected revenue in yuan, it wanted to convert those yuan into dollars immediately, because the longer they held on to those yuan, the less they would be worth. Here's the same trend in India, a little different than China, but you get the same general picture here. And again, a reversal in 2017. So now we might be interested in holding on to rupees. Not sure that I would, given all that I know. But in any event, we had the same kind of a trend reversal that we did in China. Here is Brazil. You can see that the US dollar could buy fewer Brazilian reals in 2017 than way back in 2016 or 2015. And so that trend reversal occurred sooner in Brazil. As we know, what's most important is to be sure of your ability to generate revenue at all. And in the case of Brazil, it's not the exchange rate we're concerned about. What we're concerned about is the quality of Brazil's economy and the political foundation that supports the Brazilian economy. And that foundation is shaky. So whenever you collect revenue in Brazil, regardless of the trend, you want to convert right away. This is the trend in Canada, the same kind of thing, a little bit different. Here is the Russian ruble, and the exchange rate fell just at the very end of this chart, but it was pretty much rising until then. Here's Venezuela, and we talked about Venezuela's political difficulties. You can see, look how fast, from about 1-to-1 to 10-to-1, and after, if we had extended this chart, the exchange rate would have gone up substantially from there. Long story short, Venezuela's currency isn't worth much, and its inflation rate is very high. And here we have the euro. And what you need to know, and the reason I wanted to show you these charts, is that this chart is the same as the others, although it looks to be the reverse. And what's happened is that instead of asking how many units of foreign currency can a US dollar buy, now we're saying how many dollars can a unit of foreign currency buy. And so with the European euro and the British pound sterling and the Australian dollar, it simply is convention to quote in terms of the number of US dollars that one unit of foreign currency, the euro, the Australian dollar, or the British pound sterling, can purchase. And you can see that now this makes sense, because in 2017, the euro was able to buy more dollars. It went up from about $1.05 to about $1.18. So just for your information, the way the euro, the British pound sterling, and the Australian dollar are quoted are just the reverse from the way other countries' currencies are quoted. You really need to know that, and if this is the first time you've taken a course in international business, this all seems ridiculous to you. Why do it one way for some countries and another way for other countries? And the answer is because that's the way it's done. And there's the rhyme or reason. It doesn't matter, because that's just the way it's done. And with that, I think that I will attempt to close this chart. Oh, but I'm not pressing the right button. see if I can bring this thing up here. And we've gone over quite a bit of international economics. You probably had just about all that you care to take of it by this time. And I'm sorry when I had to interrupt myself to reacquaint myself with some of these charts. But I do hope that what this little review has provided you with is an idea of some of the primary trends in international trade, not just in the United States, but worldwide. I think very often students who get involved initially in studies of international commerce are not aware of just how large and fast-growing China's economy is. China is a big economy. It's a great big country. It's got more than 1 billion more people in it than the United States does. And right behind it, in terms of population, is India. And there'll come a day, not anytime soon, but perhaps by the middle of this century, when India's economy could be the same size as the United States or close to it. Probably it'll be a while, but there's going to be a day when we're going to look at the world and see that the biggest economy probably will be China. Right next to it, India. Sometime in the distant future, India's economy larger than China's, perhaps. And then down here a little bit lower, the United States. And coming up from underneath it, perhaps even some other countries or groups of countries. And so the playing field is changing worldwide. And for you to be a player on that field, and for the company that you work for to be a player on that field, you gotta know who's on the field. You gotta know what the field looks like, and you've got to be aware that the rules of competition are changing. The rules we play by in the United States are not the rules that countries play by in China. Trust me on that one. It's really true. The rules are much different in China, as they are in India. And so we have to become much more aware of the changing balances of trade, the changing economies, the changing currency values. And that's what this course hopefully will get you started in, will give you a foundation in. I certainly hope it will, and I hope that this course will, and this little briefing will have made some small contribution to that. And with that hope, I will leave you to your further studies of international commerce. Goodbye.